I left Maple Falls with a full heart. I came back to find it hollow, like the porch that used to greet me. The wheels of my old Honda crunched along the gravel drive, but there was no creak of the porch swing, no thump of my boots on the wooden steps. Just air where the entry used to be. I sat in the car a moment longer than I meant to, engine ticking softly as it cooled, staring at the house I thought I knew. The porch was gone. In its place was raw earth, a patch of disturbed soil like someone had peeled back skin to reveal bone, and in the middle of the yellowing lawn, crooked and slightly bent, stood a sign, Auction Saturday, 11 a.m. sharp. My breath misted the windshield. I turned off the car. 6 months earlier, I'd left Maple Falls in a rush. Aunt June had taken a fall down in Georgia, and I'd packed a bag without thinking twice. I'd left behind my house key under the third step. The porch had steps back then. I climbed out, gravel shifting underfoot. My boots crunched dry leaves as I walked toward the sign. I reached out, fingers grazing the wooden stake. The edge caught my skin, sharp and dry like a splinter of time. I turned slowly, looking at the house. The shutters were closed. The curtains were new, different fabric. Someone had replaced the white lace Mom always loved with stiff beige panels that didn't belong. I heard a screen door squeak across the street and looked up to see Mrs. Grant on her porch. She was sitting in her usual spot, wrapped in a faded green shawl. Our eyes met briefly. She didn't wave, just tilted her head as if waiting for me to understand something she already knew. I left the sign standing and walked back to the car. Main Street hadn't changed much. The Rusty Bean still had its crooked chalkboard leaning outside, promising warm pie and coffee. The bookstore next to it had added a row of plants, but the same bells jingled above the door when I pushed it open. I wasn't here for books, though. I crossed the street to the diner. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and cooked bacon wrapped around me like a memory. The same red vinyl booths, the same chipped mugs. The only thing new was the flat screen above the counter, muted but flickering through a college football game. They were at their usual table, Mark with his newspaper, Diane stirring sugar into her tea. I approached slowly, the bell over the door not even making them glance up. "Hi," I said. Diane looked up, startled for a moment. "Nora, oh, we didn't think you'd be back so soon." "So soon?" "It's been 6 months." Mark folded his paper, clearing his throat. "How's June?" "Better now, but I wasn't expecting a surprise welcome from an auction sign in our front yard." I didn't sit down. I didn't even take off my coat. Diane set her spoon down too softly. "We thought we had more time," she murmured. "Things moved quickly." Mark nodded as if the speed of betrayal somehow justified it. Caleb arrived 2 minutes later, breezing in like wind on a screen door. No knock, no pause. He slid into the booth beside Diane, grabbed a menu he didn't need. "Hey, sis," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You sold the house," I said quietly. He shrugged. "It was just sitting there. No one was using it." My hands curled at my sides. "I grew up in that house. I was living there before I left." Mark sighed. "It wasn't meant to be hurtful, Nora. Caleb's starting a business and the market's good. You've got your own life now, a job. You're not exactly in need." I stared at them. "And no one thought to ask me?" Diane's voice turned gentler, that tone she used when I scraped my knee at 5. "Sweetheart, you were gone. We didn't think you'd mind." "You didn't think I'd mind losing my home?" The silence was sticky. Even Caleb shifted uncomfortably. The waitress came by, placed a mug of coffee in front of me without asking. It smelled like burnt beans and something faintly citrus, just like always. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the heat anchor me. "You could have called," I said. "We didn't want to worry you," Mark replied. I laughed once, quietly. "Right." Caleb leaned back. "You've got a good job. You live in the city. What do you need with a creaky old house in Maple Falls?" I looked at him, really looked, and realized something important. He believed that. Believed he deserved it more, that it was just property to me. Outside, a gust of wind scraped leaves along the sidewalk. Mrs. Grant still sat across the street, unmoving. I raised the cup to my lips, letting the bitterness settle before I spoke. I sipped my coffee, looked my parents in the eye, and said, I see. Then she smiles. Too calmly, they expected a fight. I gave them a smile. Smiling hurts more than crying. After I left the diner, I didn't go back to the house. There was no point standing in front of a place that no longer belonged to me. I walked instead, hands deep in my coat pockets, scarf pulled tight, boots scuffing against the sidewalk as I made my way down Sycamore Street. Maple Falls had changed in the ways small towns do, subtly, like the quiet rearranging of a living room you haven't visited in a while. The lampposts had new garlands, autumn leaves twisted around faded ribbons. The old thrift store had turned into a wine and gift boutique. Even the bakery had swapped its handwritten sign for something in cursive gold vinyl, but the smells were the same: cinnamon, wet concrete, and wood smoke. At the Rusty Bean, the door gave a familiar squeak as I pushed it open. I half expected someone to call my name. No one did. I stepped up to the counter, the same chipped formica I leaned on back in high school, and ordered my usual without thinking. Black coffee, apple pie if it's fresh. The barista, a girl no older than 20, blinked at me. You want that warmed up? I nodded. The pie was still served on ceramic plates with mismatched forks. I took my spot near the window, the one next to the radiator that clanked whenever it kicked on. The mason jar labeled tips for Tucker's college fund still sat beside the register. I dropped in a 5 without a word. Outside, Mrs. Grant passed by. I saw her reflection before I saw her face. Green shawl, walking stick, the faintest lean to her left side. She didn't look in, but she paused slightly as she passed, like she knew I was watching. I sat for a while, chewing slowly, sipping the bitter coffee that had never really improved but had always been consistent. At the bookstore, Mr. Jensen was rearranging a table of secondhand mysteries. Nora Whitman, he said with that sing-song voice that always made a name sound like a question. Mr. Jensen. He stepped down off the stool. Didn't expect you back until Christmas. Didn't expect the house to vanish either. He winced. Right. That didn't sit well with some folks. Some? He lowered his voice. This town whispers more than it speaks. You know that. Caleb made it sound like you were moving to Atlanta permanently. Said you'd released your claim, whatever that means. I raised an eyebrow. Interesting. There was a picture still taped to the side of the register. Me, age 14, holding a stack of books and a plastic trophy for the town spelling bee. I didn't remember winning, but apparently someone had thought it worth preserving. At the county records office, I waited 15 minutes while Deputy Moore helped an older woman sort through land assessments. The office smelled like pine-scented cleaner and paper that had been left too close to radiators. When he finally waved me over, he gave a tired smile. You're not in here much. Let's hope that continues, I replied, keeping my tone light. I need access to any recent filings on 412 Sycamore. He tapped, scrolled, then frowned. Caleb Whitman's name is all over this. He signed the transfer of interest forms last month. And the previous owner? Mark and Diane. They signed their portion over about 2 weeks before Caleb did. I leaned in. And me? Deputy Moore looked uneasy. There's no record of you on the current deed. What about the original? He clicked again. Well, that's strange. There's an addendum. From 1999, handwritten but notarized. He turned the screen toward me. Addendum to deed. In the event of any transfer or sale of the property, written consent is required from Nora Whitman, age 10, as co-heir, named by Russell Whitman. Russell was my grandfather, the one who built the porch with his own hands, the one who taught me how to tie a bowline with the clothesline in the backyard. I stared at the screen. Do you have a copy I can print? I asked. He hesitated. It's archived. You'd need a formal request, but I can email you a scan. I'll wait. While the copier whirred in the back, I stepped outside. The wind had picked up. It smelled like burnt leaves and distant fireplaces. Mrs. Grant was waiting by the curb, her car parked a little crooked as always. She rolled down the window before I could speak. Need a lift, Nora? I blinked. You knew I was in there? You walk the way your grandfather did when he was thinking hard. I got in. She drove slow, the way older folks do, not hesitant, just deliberate. Her hands were steady on the wheel. "I saw you yesterday," she said after a few blocks, "standing in front of the sign, looking like someone punched you without touching you." I said nothing. "You gave me soup once," she continued. "In 1999, it was freezing, and I had the flu. You came by with a bowl your grandmother made and a little note that said, 'Feel better soon.'" I vaguely remembered the note, a drawing of a smiling bowl. "You're kind," she said. "Always were, even when no one watched." I looked out the window. The light was slanting gold through the bare branches. "You always gave when no one looked," she repeated. We pulled up to my rental. I thanked her and stepped out. She didn't drive away right away, just watched until I went inside. That night, I opened the scanned document Deputy Moore had emailed. My name, my grandfather's signature, a seal from a notary who'd died 5 years ago. I stared at it for a long time, then whispered to the empty room, "They're not ready." There's a special way people close doors in Maple Falls, software, like shame or guilt. The wind had picked up overnight. I woke to the sharp rustle of dried leaves scraping across the walkway outside my rental, their dry edges ticking against the porch like a clock counting down to something I hadn't yet named. I spent the morning at the small table in the corner of the living room, surrounded by manila folders and a mug of lukewarm coffee. I printed documents from Deputy Moore's email, compared them to county listings, highlighted inconsistencies. The heater clunked once every 15 minutes, just enough to remind me it still worked, if barely. My fingers stayed cold despite the flannel sleeves rolled over my wrists. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It didn't feel like a secret. It felt like armor. By noon, I pulled on my coat and drove into town. The sky was the color of ash, and the clouds hung low, pressing the rooftops like a warning. The auction office sat beside the courthouse annex, tucked between a nail salon and a consignment store. I walked in, smiled politely at the receptionist, and asked for Mr. Clay. He emerged from a side office a few minutes later, tall, balding, button-down shirt straining slightly at the middle. He extended a hand. "Nora Whitman, yes, how can we help?" I kept my tone light. I just wanted to understand the process. For Saturday, it's not something I've ever attended. "Of course," he said, all warmth and efficiency. "It's pretty straightforward. Doors open at 10, bidding starts at 11. As long as no disputes are filed in advance, things should move quickly." "No disputes have been filed yet?" He shook his head. "Everything looks clean so far. Your brother provided full documentation." I nodded slowly. "And what happens if someone brings forward an older claim?" Mr. Clay smiled, but there was a flicker of hesitation. "We'd have to pause the proceedings. Legally, we can't sell anything in dispute, but that's rare." "Right," I said, offering another smile. "Just curious." He escorted me back to the lobby. The receptionist handed me a glossy trifold brochure about auction etiquette. I thanked her, stepped outside, and felt the wind bite at my cheeks. The treehouse was still standing. I hadn't planned to visit the backyard. My feet just carried me there. The fence was sagging but not locked. I ducked through a loose board and stepped into the space that once held my entire world. The oak tree loomed, bare and brittle. Its bark had split in places, revealing pale streaks like veins. The treehouse creaked slightly as I climbed the short ladder, more out of habit than hope. Inside, dust coated the floor, but the beams still held. A few old sketches were tacked to the walls, weathered, nearly unreadable. In the far corner, tucked behind a rusted flashlight, I found something folded and yellowed. A note. My handwriting. "Don't forget who you are." I sat back, breath catching for a moment. I had no memory of writing it, but it sounded like me, young me, the girl who still believed small things could matter. I slipped the note into my coat pocket. Later that afternoon, I heard the knock. Not the loud kind, but the kind you use when you're not sure you're welcome. Mrs. Grant stood on the porch, gloved hands wrapped around a large manila envelope. "I figured you'd still be working," she said, stepping in without waiting for an answer. "Can't sit still when something's been set wrong, can you?" I cleared a space on the table. "You brought something?" She nodded. "Something I kept for a long time. I didn't know if you'd ever need it, but I knew one day someone would forget what you did. And I couldn't let that happen." She slid the envelope toward me. I didn't open it right away. You remember that winter? She asked. 1999. Power was out. My old heater gave up. No one checked in. I remember, I said softly. You brought soup and a hot water bottle. I never asked. You never told anyone. That's the kind of thing people forget. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded document, thick paper with embossed corners. I unfolded it slowly. It was a notarized statement, a witness affidavit signed by my grandfather and co-signed by Mrs. Grant, affirming that I was to be included on any future deeds. Dated December 3rd, 1999. I didn't have the heart to bring it to your parents, she said. Didn't think it would have changed much. But now, she met my gaze steady. Now it will. The room was still. Outside, the wind howled once through the branches, then fell silent. I closed the envelope, folded my hands, and whispered, Saturday will be interesting. I expected a note. Maybe a faded photo, but what I found had edges sharp enough to cut. The envelope had been sitting on my table all night. I hadn't touched it again after whispering to the walls. But that morning, with the sky brooding and low, I made a pot of strong coffee and opened it under better light. The paper was thick, not the kind you find in modern printers. It had weight to it, fibers you could feel. The notary seal shimmered faintly under the lamp. I read every word twice, then once more aloud, as if hearing it would make it more real. The affidavit was clear. My grandfather's signature in that careful script he used only for serious things, and a witness line with Mrs. Grant's elegant lupin hand. It named me as co-beneficiary, required my consent for any sale or transfer of the property, and explicitly stated that no transaction was valid without it. It wasn't just a keepsake, it was binding. The legal part of my brain, the one I had tried to leave behind when I walked away from my old firm, clicked into motion. I opened my laptop, found the town's municipal code, and searched for the correct procedures. Then I bundled up, printed what I needed, and stepped out into the wind. Maple Falls felt colder that day. The wind didn't just bite, it settled in your bones. People walked with their heads down. A few nodded at me, but no one spoke. At the clerk's office, Deputy Moore met me at the door. He had a thermos in one hand, coffee-stained paperwork in the other. Back so soon? I have something to file. We sat in a small side room while I unfolded the document on the desk between us. His eyebrows rose slowly. This is thorough, he said, running a finger along the seal. Is it valid? He looked at me over the top of his glasses. It's older than I expected, but yes. Witnessed, notarized, specific. It should have been disclosed during title transfer. Meaning Caleb and my parents didn't mention it. Meaning the sale's legally compromised. He typed something into his system, then pulled out a form from a locked drawer. You'll need to request an injunction to halt the auction. I can process it through the local channel. It won't cancel the auction outright, but it'll stop the sale until a hearing. How long will that take? Depends on the judge's docket, but it'll stop things tomorrow. I signed the form. My hands shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the cold seeping through the old radiator vents. Deputy Moore handed me a stamped copy. You're doing the right thing, Nora, even if it ruffles feathers. I'm not looking to ruffle anything, I said, just to be seen. Afterward, I drove past the house again. I parked a block away and walked the rest. No one was home. The blinds were drawn tight, and the yard looked more overgrown than it had 3 days ago. The sign was still there, now flapping slightly in the wind. I circled around back. The gate creaked, but opened without resistance. The treehouse stood exactly where it always had, wedged between two thick limbs of the old oak. The ladder was brittle, the boards gray with weather, but it held my weight as I climbed. Inside it smelled of dust and memory. Bits of old chalk drawings remained on the floor. The crate we used to call a treasure chest still sat in the corner, now home to a family of spiders. I ran my fingers along the wall and found what I didn't know I was looking for, a patch of wood, scratched faintly by a child's hand. Don't forget who you are. My breath caught. The letters were mine, etched with a stick or nail, uneven and deliberate. I remembered writing them. I remembered the cold that day, the sting of my fingers, the voice in my head repeating the phrase like a prayer. I sat in the corner, knees pulled up, the wind whispering just outside. It was almost dark when I made it back to the rental. I reheated leftover stew, stared at my computer, and didn't type anything. My mind kept circling the same loop: porch steps, notarized seals, Caleb's smug face. The phone rang just after 9. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the voice. "Ms. Whitman," Mr. Clay said, "we've been notified of your filing." "Yes." He cleared his throat. "You'll need to attend tomorrow, in person." Some people show up to take. I showed up to remind them who gave first. I arrived 15 minutes early. The Maple Falls Town Hall had been converted into an auction room, just like the brochure promised. Folding chairs in even rows, a wooden podium up front, and the buzz of quiet conversations from neighbors who didn't quite know where to look when I walked in. I chose a seat near the center, aisle side, not too close, not too far. I held the envelope in my lap, hands folded over it like a hymn book. I didn't plan to speak unless I had to, but I wasn't going to be silent either. Caleb arrived right on time, striding in with that self-assured bounce he always wore when he thought the world was bending in his favor. He was dressed like he wanted to be seen: navy blazer, crisp shirt, no tie, hair a little too styled for a Saturday morning in a town this size. Our eyes met briefly. He looked away. Mark and Diane slipped in quietly behind him, taking seats near the back. Mom wore her Sunday coat. Dad carried a manila folder, probably filled with papers Caleb had printed but hadn't read. Mrs. Grant was already there, tucked into a back corner, her green shawl wrapped tight. She gave me the barest of nods when I glanced back. No smile, just acknowledgement. Mr. Clay took the podium at exactly 11. "Good morning, folk," he began. "Today's auction involves one property, 412 Sycamore. The bidding will proceed as soon as I finish the formal reading." His voice faded into a hum as I studied the room. About 30 people, some curious, others opportunistic. A few were neighbors who probably still remembered the old porch swing and the smell of my grandmother's pies. When bidding opened, it jumped faster than I expected. An older man in a brown cap started at 90,000. A couple in matching sweaters countered. The price climbed to 120 within minutes. Caleb leaned back in his seat, one leg crossed over the other, arms spread casually along the backrest. His grin stretched wider with every nod from Mr. Clay. And then I stood. It wasn't loud. I didn't make a speech. I just stood, held up the envelope, and said calmly, "There's a legal issue with this property." The room frozen. Mr. Clay blinked. "Ms. Whitman." I stepped into the aisle, walked slowly to the front, and handed him the envelope. "This affidavit was filed yesterday," I said. "It includes a notarized document from 1999 naming me as co-owner. Sale cannot proceed without my consent." He pulled the document out and scanned the top page. Then again. The color drained from his face. "Is this verified?" "Yes, filed with Deputy Moore, time-stamped and stamped by the clerk." He cleared his throat. "Then we must pause the auction pending review." A low murmur spread through the room like a ripple in still water. The couple, in the matching sweaters, exchanged glances. Someone coughed. Caleb stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She hasn't lived there in years." Mr. Clay held up a hand. "Mr. Whitman, please." "She abandoned the place," Caleb insisted. "She was gone for months. We needed the money." I turned to face him. "I was in Georgia, caring for Aunt June after her stroke." He flushed. "You never said you were coming back." I didn't know I had to make an announcement to keep what was already mine. Dad rose next. "Let's not do this here." "We already are," I said. "You sold a house that didn't belong solely to you. You ignored a legal clause your father added to protect me." Diane covered her mouth with one hand. Her eyes were glassy. Caleb scoffed. "You're just doing this to punish us." I tilted my head. "Funny thing about being invisible. You see everything." Silence, thick enough to hold. Mr. Clay cleared his throat again. "We'll halt the auction, effective immediately. All parties will be notified of the next legal steps. Thank you for your understanding. People began to rise, coats rustling, chairs scraping. No one looked directly at me. I gathered my things slowly. The envelope was back in my bag, safe and solid. As I turned toward the exit, a familiar voice stopped me. I have one more thing, if you're still willing. I didn't come back for the house. I came back for the version of myself that lived in it. The morning air smelled different, like something had lifted. The sky was impossibly blue, and the sun sat low, casting long shadows that stretched across Maple Falls like old stories waiting to be retold. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug and sat on the porch of the rental, the one with the chipped paint and the uneven step. It didn't matter. The coffee was strong, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to rush anywhere. Inside, my bag sat by the door, still packed with yesterday's papers. I had no plans to reopen it. Not today. I took out a small notepad and started to write, not a list, not a plan, just a letter to myself. You were never invisible, they just chose not to see you. But you kept giving anyway, that's your strength, not theirs. I folded the note and tucked it in my coat pocket. The same coat I'd worn the day I climbed the treehouse. A knock came at the door, soft, not urgent. I opened it to find Mrs. Grant, holding an envelope far less weathered than the last. She smiled without preamble. Walk with me? We strolled slowly down the block. The trees had thinned out, their leaves now carpeting the sidewalks in brittle gold and rust. She didn't speak until we reached the narrow gravel path that curved around Sycamore and Walnut. The little strip of road most people forgot was even there. We stopped in front of a modest one-story cottage. White siding, pale green shutters, a front porch barely big enough for 2 chairs and a potted fern. This was my sister's place, she said. She passed years ago. I've been keeping it up, hoping it'd find the right soul again. I looked at her, uncertain. She held out the envelope. It's yours now. No strings, no debts. Just a place for someone who gives when no one's watching. I opened it slowly. A deed. My name is already written in ink, notarized, signed. I can't. You can, she said. And you will. I couldn't find words, only the lump rising in my throat and the strange warm ache in my chest. She patted my arm. You reminded this town of something it forgot. That's not small, Nora, that's everything. Later that afternoon, I returned to the old house, not to confront, not to claim, just to visit. I slipped through the back fence where the board still bowed just enough to let a small girl through. The grass was longer now, the house quiet, blinds still drawn. I didn't go inside. I climbed the ladder once more, creaking and stubborn. In the treehouse, I sat for a while. The dust had settled. The note I found earlier still felt warm in my pocket. I pulled it out and read it again. Don't forget who you are. Then I folded it carefully, tucking it into a small crack in the wall, behind one of the old beams. A secret between me and the wind. I climbed down and walked to the rusty bean. My usual table was empty. The staff greeted me with a nod, a smile, nothing more. That was enough. I ordered pie and coffee, still black, still bitter, and sat near the window, watching as a pair of kids raced by, with scarves trailing behind them like banners of freedom. The slice of pie was half eaten, my book resting face down beside it. The cafe buzzed softly around me, forks tapping, spoons clinking, a bell over the door every now and then. No one needed anything from me. No one expected anything. And I felt full. I didn't reclaim a house. I reclaimed something better, myself. Sometimes returning home isn't about reclaiming walls or furniture. It's about rediscovering the quiet strength you forgot you had. In the hush of old leaves and the warmth of a neighbor's kindness, I found more than a house. I found herself. Kindness, given freely and without applause, has a way of echoing back when we need it most. When we stop judging by appearances and start seeing people for who they are, we make space for healing to begin. So maybe today, hold the door a little longer, offer that gentle word, because even the smallest gesture might be the one someone carries with them all the way back home.